and you keep getting better. Thank you very much. And it's wonderful to be in person again. And most special, at least for me, is that this is a US-China event, and that we are doing it together. And that, I think, is a model that Washington could follow a little bit more. So in 1776, Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations. And in that book, he extolled the virtues of trade, but he also had a line that, quote, defense is more important than opulence or trade. And I suspect that the leadership in Beijing, be it Ambassador Jean or Ambassador Burns in Beijing, would agree with that assessment, that defense is more important than trade. And then Speaker Pelosi's, thank you. Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan very much highlighted the security tensions between the two countries. They are very real, they are very sharp, and none of us should doubt the seriousness. So I'm very pleased that this time the Chinese side seems to be finishing its military exercises around Taiwan and de-escalating the crisis over the shorter term, even if it is not fully resolved. I think that the acute phase of this crisis is probably finished or will be finished soon. But let's make no mistake, the chronic condition continues. So I suspect that, as Ambassador Jean said, or as future government speakers will say, that really we have kind of two quite different interpretations of the US-China bilateral relationship. On the government side, there is an emphasis on defense, on national sovereignty, national security, the rule of law, and the other important principles that serve to underscore the foundation of the global order. But as business people, our view and our perceptions are a little bit different. We respect these principles, but at the same time, we approach the world from a more pragmatic, in a more pragmatic manner, and we value incremental progress. And by the way, this isn't a one-sided conversation. As we just heard so eloquently, Chinese companies invested in America are very pragmatic, and they are here for the longer term. And they employ hundreds of thousands of Americans. And exactly in the same manner, American companies in China are very pragmatic. We will follow Chinese law, and we are proud of the many contributions that we have made to Chinese economic development in the past. And we hope to make more contributions in the future. So in this theater of US-China relations, the principle of defense and the pragmatism of business are in tension with each other, as Adam Smith warned 256 years ago. And defense is the stronger force. And I think that everyone in the business community recognizes this. So what does that mean? If the principle of defense is the stronger partner and the pragmatism of business is the weaker partner, I suspect that we'll see more decoupling. But hopefully, it will be in a manner that is thoughtful and properly scoped in a way that allows both countries to continue to prosper. I see reciprocal decoupling measures from both countries, from both governments. The decoupling of the Chinese side is different from that of the US side, but we should not question China's determination to achieve self-reliance in technology, energy, and agriculture, despite the fact that the whole concept of self-reliance would be antithetical to the WTO and to the foundations of the global economy. China has dedicated a stock of as much as 11% of GDP to support its industrial policies, to aiming for self-reliance in technology, energy, and agriculture. According to Barry Naughton of the University of California, San Diego, over $1 trillion has been set aside for industrial policy in China, 11% of GDP. Scott Kennedy of CSIS corroborates Barry Naughton's research and suggests that on an annual basis, about 3 or 4% of GDP is used for industrial policy. 4 times that as a percentage of GDP as the next most active country, South Korea. China's overall express policy of dual circulation emphasizes self-reliance whenever feasible, and that leaves foreign investors in China very uneasy. What is our place in the longer term? Will we be allowed to compete on an equal and level playing field? How long are we welcome? And under what terms? In addition to China's industrial policy subsidies bonanza, everyone should be concerned about the new data policies that are being promulgated in Beijing. So I won't go through the whole list of the recent laws that are promulgated, but I would note that they are vague and oftentimes contradictory, and they're issued by different ministries. And thus, both American and Chinese banks and all large companies are having a hard time complying with data regulations in accordance to Chinese law. There is a huge, very real risk that China will one day become a data island, and that channels of information flow into and out of China will become ever more constricted. I hope that that doesn't occur, because if it does, it will hurt Chinese companies and the Chinese people more than anyone else. On the U.S. side, while the U.S. government says that decoupling is not their objective, nonetheless, there are a good number of regulatory initiatives that seem to further that end. For example, U.S.-China Business Council has a list of, today, 1,069 Chinese entities that are put onto one or more of the other American sanctions regimes. Now, if you were to look for a counterpart European or Japanese law, how many Chinese companies have the Europeans and the Japanese sanctioned? You'll find a list of 0. So effectively, these are unilateral sanctions that asymmetrically disadvantage American companies, and indeed, in a perverse way, help our European and Japanese competitors. Sanctions, if they must be imposed, should be multilateral. Otherwise, they asymmetrically hurt American competitiveness, jobs, and the economy. In the meantime, let me say a couple of words about upcoming regulation that I think all business people should be aware of. So because I'm from Washington, most of this is not great news, but you're used to that. I'd like to talk about the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, the CHIPS Act just signed into law today, outbound investment controls, and the Taiwan Policy Act. And if you'd like to, I'd be happy to talk about the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act. So while I think all of us would support the goals of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, that is, that there should be no forced labor anywhere within the global supply chain. I would have to acknowledge that I am personally not a big fan of this act for a lot of reasons. The most important one is that I think it'll just hurt a lot of Uyghurs who are going to find it get more difficult to find jobs. That's exactly the opposite of what we would like to happen. But the act has a quote-unquote rebuttable presumption, I'll talk about that anything in whole or part, we should talk about that, made in Xinjiang is made by forced labor and is thus inadmissible for entry into the United States. First, let's talk about in whole or in part. Anything in whole or in part from Xinjiang is inadmissible. Well, what that means, taken to an extreme, is that at the atomic level, if something is from Xinjiang, it is inadmissible. Now, I don't think that Customs is going to be doing atomic research on imports, but the principle is something that I think is a concern. Let's talk about rebuttable presumption. That's an interesting term. In practice, it means that if a product has any nexus to Xinjiang, it is presumed to have forced labor, unless you can prove otherwise. In more common terms, you are guilty until you prove yourself innocent. And that is very difficult to do if there is a nexus with Xinjiang. So keep your eyes on this legislation. Thus far, there hasn't been that much enforcement action, but I would expect Customs to really move on it in the future. Let's talk about the CHIPS Act for a second. Passed today. And we applaud the Congress and the administration for getting this trademark legislation across. But it's useful to read the fine print. There are safeguards in the bill that will prevent recipients of the $52 billion in subsidies for chip companies from investing in advanced semiconductor manufacturing in China and a few other countries. Now, this is an interesting provision. We'll be watching with great interest how the U.S. Department of Commerce defines the parameters and the conditions under which it will be imposed. And we'll watch with great interest all of the semiconductor manufacturing companies from around the world, whether or not they'll take this money and accept those conditions. It will be interesting because China is a very major buyer and producer of chips. And all of these companies wish to maintain their access to the China market. Let me say a couple words about outbound CFIUS, or outbound investment controls. The progenitor to this initiative was the National Critical Capabilities Defense Act authored by John Cornyn of Texas and Bob Casey of Pennsylvania. It was passed out of the House, but stripped out of the CHIPS bill only a couple of weeks ago. So the purpose of the bill is to regulate American high technology companies, venture capital, or private equity from investing in Chinese companies that are developing technologies that may impact on American national security. So I would argue that this is a legitimate subject of debate. But at least in my view, regulating outbound investment on a US-only unilateral basis is a terrible way to approach the problem. Just like other unilateral export controls that I discussed earlier, it will asymmetrically hurt American companies and provide, in fact, a comparative advantage to our European and Japanese competitors. And in my view, that's a problem. It would be far better to confront China's industrial policies, and I count up about over 100 of them, and the very large subsidies given to Chinese companies in a more direct manner, and demand that China live up to its WTO commitments, particularly vis-a-vis subsidies, and provide a level playing field for foreign companies. And also the United States simply needs to run faster and be more competitive. I'll skip the Taiwan Policy Act due to time, but I do recommend that you all take a look at that draft legislation. It is important, and it could precipitate more attention in the future. So to wrap up, I would note that Adam Smith got it exactly right. Defense is more important than trade. But when we look at American national interests, I think we just need to realize that it's going to be harder and harder to find the optimal balance between the principles of defense and national security with the pragmatism of business and prosperity. There are necessary trade-offs between defense and prosperity, but they are difficult to find. To a large degree, our future security and prosperity are intertwined. I, for one, would like to be able to find the security that we American citizens demand without the risk of a drop in our standard of living. I believe that it is possible to achieve it, but it will take masterful diplomacy on both sides. Do you think we're up to it? Thank you.